Sure. That
Do
many
you believe that fornication is a form of sexual perversion?
Senator, my personal views, my religious views, what I was speaking at that time were for the edification of the people that I was preaching to. As a judge sitting here today, my obligation is to apply the rule of law.
Yeah, I understand that, but
Constitution.
my obligation is to try to understand you, because this is a lifetime appointment. Do you believe that fornication, which I assume you mean by that the sex act, is a form of sexual perversion?
Senator, the doctrine of the church that I was at does state that fornication is a sin.
Well, what do you mean by fornication?
Any sexual act outside the bounds of marriage.
Okay. So
You just watched a man squirm under the weight of his own moral certitude, and here is what should make your blood absolutely boil, because this is not just some obscure confirmation hearing that disappears into the ether of C-SPAN archives at 3 a.m. This is the crystallization of a theocratic movement that has been meticulously constructing its infrastructure for decades, and now we're watching it play out in real time with lifetime appointments to the federal bench. And I need you to understand the stakes here, because when that senator asks whether fornication is sexual perversion, and the nominee starts hedging and dodging and talking about edification, and the people he was preaching to, what you're witnessing is the careful choreography of Christian nationalism, attempting to infiltrate the one institution that's supposed to protect us from the tyranny of religious zealotry. The judicial nominee knows exactly what he's doing when he pivots to his obligation to apply the rule of law, because he's been coached within an inch of his life by handlers who understand that the American public is not quite ready to openly embrace judges who will drag us back to a puritanical hellscape where the state enforces Bronze Age sexual morality. But make no mistake about what's happening beneath that veneer of judicial temperament, and here's where it gets absolutely infuriating, because we've seen this playbook before, and yet somehow we keep falling for it. The Constitution explicitly prohibits religious tests for office, and that's not some accidental clause buried in the fine print. That's Article 6, and the founders put it there, because they understood with crystal clarity that theocracy is the death knell of democracy. Yet here we are in the 21st century, watching a man who stood in a pulpit and preached that fornication is sexual perversion, now claiming he can somehow compartmentalize those deeply held convictions when he dons the black robe. And you want to know what the truly sinister part is? The machinery behind this has become so sophisticated that groups are literally pressuring Republican senators to apply explicit religious tests to judicial nominees. They're demanding judges pass a biblical worldview standard, and they're not even hiding it anymore. We're talking about organizations that are openly seeking what they call a return to Christ-centered constitutional roots, which is historical revisionism of the most pernicious kind, because the founders were deliberate in their construction of a secular government precisely to escape the religious persecution that had plagued Europe for centuries. But here's the bombshell that should make every progressive activist sit up and pay attention, because this is where the culture war metastasizes into something far more dangerous than symbolic battles over pronouns or holiday greetings. We're watching the systematic capture of the federal judiciary by ideologues who believe that their religious convictions should supersede constitutional protections, and the implications for marginalized communities are absolutely catastrophic. Think about what happens when judges who believe all sex outside marriage is sinful and perverse get to rule on cases involving LGBTQ+ rights, reproductive freedom, disability rights, marriage equality, and the entire constellation of civil liberties that depend on the courts recognizing that private sexual and romantic choices are beyond the legitimate reach of state power. This nominee stood in front of a congregation and preached that fornication is not just wrong but perverted. That's not a minor theological quibble about the finer points of denominational doctrine. That's a comprehensive worldview that necessarily categorizes vast swaths of human behavior as deviant and pathological. And when Senator Kennedy presses him on whether he believes premarital sex is wrong, and the nominee confirms that his church doctrine states fornication is sin, and that fornication means any sexual act outside marriage, we need to follow that logic to its inevitable conclusion, because judges don't operate in some pristine realm of pure legal reasoning, untouched by their fundamental beliefs about human nature and morality. When this nominee eventually rules on a case involving reproductive rights or contraception access or sex education in schools, or any of the countless ways that sexual autonomy intersects with constitutional law, does anyone seriously believe that his conviction that all non-marital sex is sinful perversion won't color his interpretation of precedent and his application of constitutional principles. The entire premise that judges can perfectly bifurcate their deeply held moral convictions from their judicial decision-making is a convenient fiction that we've allowed to persist because it makes the confirmation process less overtly confrontational, but it's a fiction nonetheless, and the consequences of indulging that fiction are becoming more apparent every single day. Now let's talk about what this means for disabled people specifically, because the framing here about disability rights and marriage is not hyperbole or some progressive stretch to manufacture outrage. It's actually at the heart of the issue, and here's why this matters so profoundly. Religious conservative movements have historically and continue to maintain beliefs about sexuality and marriage that are fundamentally at odds with disability rights and bodily autonomy. When you have a judge who believes that all sexual activity outside marriage is perverse and sinful, you're looking at someone whose worldview necessarily includes judgments about who should be engaging in sexual activity at all, and disabled people have been subjected to horrifying levels of sexual policing throughout American history, from forced sterilization, to denial of marriage rights, to institutionalization specifically designed to prevent them from having intimate relationships. The idea that sexuality is only legitimate within the confines of heterosexual marriage has been weaponized for centuries to deny disabled people fundamental human dignity and autonomy, and when we're confirming judges who preach this exact doctrine, we are laying the groundwork for future rulings that could devastate disability rights. The eugenic thinking that led to Buck v. Bell, that monstrous 1927 Supreme Court decision upholding forced sterilization that has never been explicitly overturned, was rooted in precisely this kind of moralizing about who deserves sexual and reproductive autonomy, and it was cloaked in the language of social hygiene and protection of public welfare, but at its core was a belief system about whose bodies and whose desires are legitimate. When you have judges who believe that non-marital sex is perversion, you create the conditions for rulings that treat disabled people's sexuality as inherently problematic, as something that needs to be controlled and regulated and potentially prohibited for their own good or for the protection of society. And this is not ancient history we're talking about. Disabled people continue to face barriers to marriage, continue to face guardianship arrangements that strip them of the right to make decisions about their own intimate lives, continue to face institutional policies that prevent them from having romantic and sexual relationships, and all of this happens in a legal framework where judges' attitudes about sexuality and autonomy are absolutely determinative. Here's what makes this moment particularly dangerous, and why we need to be sounding every possible alarm, because the convergence of Christian nationalism and judicial capture is happening at precisely the moment when abortion rights have been decimated, when LGBTQ+ rights are under sustained assault, when disability rights protections are being challenged, and when the entire framework of constitutional privacy rights that was built up over decades is being systematically dismantled. The Dobbs decision that overturned Roe was not an isolated event. It was the opening salvo in a comprehensive campaign to roll back the sexual revolution and return to a legal regime where the state can regulate intimate behavior based on religious moral codes. And the architects of this movement have been explicit about their goals. They're coming for contraception access. They're coming for marriage equality. They're coming for the right to privacy in intimate relationships. And they need judges in place who share their theological commitments in order to make it happen. When Justice Alito wrote in Dobbs that rights not explicitly enumerated in the Constitution don't receive protection unless they're deeply rooted in our nation's history and tradition, he was providing the roadmap for dismantling every civil rights protection that wasn't specifically contemplated in the 18th century, and that standard is catastrophic for disability rights, for LGBTQ+ rights, for women's rights, for every marginalized community that has had to fight for recognition, precisely because historical tradition meant their oppression and exclusion. So when we're confirming judges who preached from pulpits about sexual perversion and fornication as sin, we're confirming judges who will apply Alito's framework to find that there's no deeply rooted historical tradition protecting the rights of disabled people to marry without interference, protecting the rights of LGBTQ+ people to intimate relationships, protecting the rights of anyone to make autonomous decisions about their bodies and their sexuality that don't conform to conservative Christian doctrine. And let's be absolutely clear about what's happening with the choreography of these confirmation hearings, because the Republican strategy has been to cry religious persecution whenever Democrats ask probing questions about nominees' ideological commitments while simultaneously working to install judges who will impose those exact religious beliefs through their rulings. The American Family Association is openly demanding religious tests for judicial nominees. They're explicitly calling for judges who meet a biblical worldview standard, And yet when progressives point out that a nominee's public statements about fornication and sexual perversion might be relevant to his ability to impartially adjudicate cases involving sexual autonomy, we're told that we're engaging in unconstitutional religious discrimination. It's a brazenly hypocritical two-step, where conservative Christian beliefs are supposedly both completely determinative of how they'll rule, and also completely off-limits for questioning, and we cannot allow this rhetorical sleight of hand to continue unchallenged. The senator in this clip is doing what every senator has an obligation to do during confirmation hearings, which is to probe whether a nominee's demonstrated beliefs and public statements suggest they will be unable to fairly apply constitutional protections, and that's not a religious test, that's an assessment of judicial temperament and commitment to neutrality. If a nominee had given public speeches arguing that capitalism is theft and private property is immoral, you can bet every Republican senator would be demanding to know whether that nominee could fairly adjudicate contract disputes and takings clause cases. If a nominee had preached that law enforcement is inherently racist and police testimony should never be credited, Republicans would insist that disqualifies them from the bench. But somehow when the ideology in question is conservative Christianity, we're supposed to pretend that deeply held convictions about sin and perversion have no bearing on judicial decision-making, and that double standard is precisely what's allowing the federal judiciary to be captured by religious extremists. Now let's talk about what fornication as a category of sin actually encompasses in this theological framework, because this is not some narrow prohibition. This is a comprehensive regulatory schema for human sexuality that reaches into every aspect of intimate life. In conservative evangelical and fundamentalist theology, fornication encompasses premarital sex, extramarital sex, same-sex relationships, any sexual activity that doesn't occur within heterosexual marriage, and often extends to things like masturbation, certain sexual acts even within marriage, pornography, and essentially any expression of sexuality outside extremely rigid boundaries. When this nominee says his church doctrine holds that fornication is sin and defines fornication as any sexual act outside marriage, he's articulating a worldview in which the vast majority of human sexual behavior is sinful and perverse, and we're supposed to believe that won't affect how he rules on cases involving sexual harassment, reproductive rights, sex education, contraception access, sodomy laws, obscenity statutes, or any of the countless ways that sexual autonomy intersects with constitutional law. And here's where we need to connect this to the broader Project 2025 agenda and the systematic effort to reshape American government according to Christian nationalist principles, because judicial capture is not happening in isolation. It's part of a coordinated strategy that includes executive branch appointments, legislative initiatives, state-level campaigns, and grassroots mobilization, all aimed at the same goal of establishing a legal framework where conservative Christian morality is enforced through state power. The people behind this movement have been explicit in their writings and their organizing that they view the sexual revolution as the original sin of modern America, and that rolling back sexual freedom is essential to their vision of national restoration. They want to recriminalize sodomy, they want to ban pornography, they want to eliminate no-fault divorce, they want to restrict contraception, they want to prosecute abortion as murder, and they need judges in place who view non-marital sexuality as perversion in order to make these goals achievable. When we look at recent confirmation battles and the treatment of nominees, we see a pattern that should terrify anyone committed to religious pluralism and secular government. Republican senators have been remarkably successful at confirming judges with deep ties to religious conservative organizations, while simultaneously blocking or slow-walking nominees who don't share that ideological profile. Meanwhile, Democratic senators who ask questions about religious conservative nominees' stated beliefs get accused of unconstitutional religious tests, and this has created an asymmetry where one ideological faction can pack the courts while facing no meaningful scrutiny of the beliefs that will inform their rulings. And we know that courts are being packed because we've seen the fruits of this strategy in the cascade of decisions dismantling abortion rights, weakening the wall between church and state, expanding religious exemptions from anti-discrimination laws, and gradually constructing a constitutional framework where religious liberty means the right to impose one's religious beliefs on others. The implications for reproductive freedom alone should be enough to mobilize every progressive into sustained resistance, because once you have judges who believe that all non-marital sex is sinful perversion, you have judges who will find ways to restrict abortion access even in cases of rape and incest, who will limit contraception access for unmarried people, who will allow employers to deny coverage for birth control, who will permit pharmacists to refuse to fill prescriptions based on religious objections, and who will uphold parental consent laws and mandatory waiting periods and medically unnecessary ultrasound requirements, and every other barrier that's been erected to make reproductive health care as difficult and humiliating as possible. These judges will cloak their rulings in neutral-sounding language about state interests and rational basis review and narrowly construing precedent, but the animating force will be the conviction that sexual activity outside marriage is wrong and should be discouraged through legal mechanisms. And let's talk about the intersection of all of this with LGBTQ+ rights, because if you believe that fornication defined as any sex outside heterosexual marriage is sinful perversion, then you necessarily believe that all same-sex intimacy, regardless of the relationship context, is perverse. This is not incidental. This is definitional. When this nominee articulates his church's doctrine, he is stating a position that categorizes queer sexuality as inherently deviant, and that belief system is fundamentally incompatible with the equal protection guarantees that were supposed to be secured through Obergefell and Lawrence v. Texas and the slowly constructed constitutional framework recognize LGBTQ+ dignity and autonomy. We are already seeing cases percolating through the federal courts challenging marriage equality, challenging anti-discrimination protections, challenging the right of same-sex couples to adopt, challenging transgender people's access to healthcare and identity documents, and every single one of these cases will eventually land before judges who we're confirming right now in these hearings. The strategic patience of the Christian right on judicial appointments has been remarkable, and progressives need to learn from it, while fighting it with everything we have, because they understood decades ago that lasting change happens through the courts, that constitutional interpretation is the battlefield where long-term victories are won, and that getting judges in place who share their theological commitments would pay dividends for generations. They built the Federalist Society, they cultivated judicial pipelines, they developed vetting processes, they played the long game, and now we're living with the consequences as fundamental rights are being stripped away by judges who were specifically selected for their commitment to rolling back the social and legal changes of the past 60 years. And the cruelty is that they did this while accusing progressives of judicial activism, while claiming they just want judges who follow the original meaning of the Constitution, while wrapping their theocratic ambitions in the rhetoric of neutral principles and textualism. But here's what we need to understand about the originalist project, and why it's so perfectly designed for achieving Christian nationalist goals. Because when you limit constitutional protections to those explicitly enumerated or deeply rooted in tradition, you're creating a framework where anything that challenged historical practices of oppression becomes constitutionally vulnerable. Women didn't have full legal personhood at the founding. LGBTQ+ people were criminalized and persecuted throughout most of American history. Disabled people were institutionalized and sterilized as a matter of routine policy. People of color were enslaved and then subjected to apartheid for a century after emancipation. So when judges apply the standard that rights must be deeply rooted in our nation's history and tradition to receive constitutional protection, they're saying that the long struggles for liberation and equality don't count, that historical oppression is actually evidence against recognizing rights, that tradition means the right to continue subjugating people who have always been subjugated. And this brings us back to the specific question about fornication and sexual perversion, because when you're trying to determine whether someone can be a fair and impartial judge, what they've publicly stated about human sexuality is absolutely relevant evidence. If someone stood up and gave speeches arguing that interracial relationships are immoral and perverted, no one would claim that asking about those statements constitutes a religious test. Everyone would recognize that such beliefs are disqualifying because they're incompatible with equal protection principles. If someone had preached that women who work outside the home are violating natural law, we'd understand that they can't fairly adjudicate sex discrimination cases. But because the prejudice in question is framed in terms of sexual morality and cloaked in religious language, we're supposed to pretend it's off limits for examination, and that's a category error that has devastating real-world consequences. The disabled community has learned through bitter experience that judges' attitudes about sexuality and bodily autonomy directly determine whether they'll uphold disability rights or find ways to limit them, and there's a long and horrifying history here that contemporary progressives need to be more educated about because it illuminates what's at stake. For much of the 20th century, disabled people were subjected to forced sterilization under state laws that were upheld by the Supreme Court. They were denied the right to marry through statutes that prohibited marriage for people deemed mentally deficient or likely to produce defective offspring. They were institutionalized not for medical reasons, but to prevent them from having sexual relationships and reproducing, and all of this was justified through a combination of eugenic pseudoscience and moral panic about improper sexuality. The judges who upheld these practices weren't mustache-twirling villains, They were people who believed they were protecting society and upholding legitimate state interests, but their understanding of legitimate state interests was shaped by beliefs about whose sexuality is natural and acceptable and whose is deviant and dangerous. And we have not moved as far from that history as we'd like to believe, because disabled people still face guardianship arrangements that strip decision-making authority over their intimate lives, still face institutional policies prohibiting sexual relationships, still face barriers to accessing reproductive health care, still face assumptions that they're not capable of consenting to sexual activity or shouldn't be having it at all. When judges believe that non-marital sex is inherently problematic, they're more likely to uphold paternalistic restrictions on disabled people's autonomy because they start from the premise that lots of sexual activity is properly subject to state regulation and control. The framework that says fornication is perverse creates the conceptual space for treating disabled people's sexuality as especially perverse or especially in need of oversight. And that's not a hypothetical concern. That's the lived reality for people navigating a legal system that continues to deny them full personhood and self-determination. Let me tell you what's going to happen if we don't mount a more vigorous resistance to these confirmation processes, because the trajectory is clear and it's accelerating. We're going to see a federal judiciary increasingly dominated by judges who view their role as enforcing religious conservative moral codes through ostensibly neutral legal reasoning. We're going to see more decisions like Dobbs that strip away constitutional protections by claiming they weren't properly established in the first place. We're going to see the dismantling of civil rights protections for LGBTQ+ people, for women seeking reproductive health care, for disabled people asserting autonomy, for anyone whose existence or choices offend conservative Christian sensibilities. And we're going to see all of this justified through the language of religious freedom and traditional values and originalism, as if there's something neutral and apolitical about imposing one religious tradition's sexual morality on an entire pluralistic society. The confirmation hearing we just watched is a microcosm of a much larger battle over whether America will remain a secular democracy with robust protections for individual liberty, or will slide into a soft theocracy where constitutional rights are subordinated to conservative Christian doctrine. And I need every person who cares about justice to understand that this is not alarmist rhetoric. This is a sober assessment based on what conservative legal movement figures have explicitly stated their goals to be, and what we're seeing play out in courts across the country. When judicial nominees who preach about fornication as sexual perversion get confirmed to lifetime appointments, they will spend decades issuing rulings that reflect those convictions, and those rulings will compound and build on each other, and gradually reshape the constitutional landscape in ways that will be extraordinarily difficult to reverse. Think about the compound effect of having hundreds of federal judges who all share similar religious conservative commitments about sexuality, deciding thousands of cases over decades, because that's what we're looking at here. Each individual case might seem narrow. Maybe it's about whether a particular abortion restriction is permissible, or whether a specific anti-discrimination law violates religious freedom, or whether a given guardianship arrangement is appropriate. But in the aggregate, these rulings construct the framework within which everyone's rights are understood and protected or not protected. And when the judges making these decisions start from the premise that non-marital sexuality is perverse, when they believe that traditional family structures are divinely ordained and departures from them are sinful, when their theological commitments trump their obligation to protect individual autonomy from state interference, the framework they construct will be one that enables oppression while claiming to uphold freedom. The senator's questioning in this clip is actually quite restrained, because he could have pushed much harder on the implications of the nominee's stated beliefs. He could have asked about specific cases involving contraception, or same-sex adoption, or reproductive rights, and demanded to know how someone who preached that fornication is sexual perversion would rule. He could have pointed out the fundamental tension between believing that vast swaths of human behavior are sinful perversion and claiming ability to neutrally apply constitutional protections for sexual autonomy and privacy. But the political constraints on Democratic senators in these hearings are real, because Republicans have been so successful at framing questions about religious beliefs as unconstitutional persecution that pushing too hard risks backlash and provides ammunition for claims of anti-Christian bias. So we get this uncomfortable dance where everyone knows that the nominee's religious convictions will inform his rulings, but no one can say it directly, and the nominee gets to hide behind platitudes about applying the rule of law, while his entire public record suggests he views the law through a very particular theological lens. And here's what should make you absolutely furious about the framing of this as a religious liberty issue, because the real threat to religious liberty comes from judges who want to impose their religious beliefs on everyone else, not from senators who ask about those beliefs during confirmation hearings. True religious pluralism requires a government that doesn't favor any particular theology, that protects everyone's right to believe and worship as they choose or not believe at all, and that doesn't enforce religious moral codes through law. When we confirm judges who believe fornication is sexual perversion, and give them the power to decide cases involving sexual autonomy and reproductive rights and family structure, we're enabling the government to prefer one religious tradition's moral framework over all others, and that's the actual religious liberty violation. People of different faiths and no faith have different views about sexual morality, about when life begins, about the structure of families and relationships, and in a truly free society, those differences are negotiated through democratic deliberation and individual choice, not imposed through judicial fiat by judges selected for their commitment to a particular theological vision. The Christian right has managed to flip the script so effectively that they've convinced huge swaths of the public that religious freedom means the right to discriminate against LGBTQ+ people and deny reproductive health care and impose Christian prayer in public schools and use state power to enforce biblical morality, when actually those things are all violations of religious freedom because they involve the government privileging Christianity and enforcing its norms on everyone, including people who don't share those beliefs. And they've done this in part by cultivating a persecution narrative, where any limitation on their ability to impose their beliefs is framed as anti-Christian discrimination. So when Democrats ask whether a judicial nominee's public statements about sexual perversion might affect his ability to fairly decide cases, that gets spun as a religious test and an attack on people of faith, when it's actually an entirely legitimate inquiry into judicial temperament and commitment to constitutional principles. We are at a genuinely dangerous inflection point, because the combination of an emboldened Christian nationalist movement, a Republican Party fully captured by that movement, and a decades-long project of judicial capture coming to fruition means that the framework of constitutional protections that progressives fought for over generations is being systematically dismantled, and it's happening through courts stacked with judges who view that entire framework as an illegitimate imposition of secular humanist ideology on a supposedly Christian nation. These judges are not hiding their agenda, they're announcing it in their dissents and their law review articles and their speeches to Federalist Society gatherings, and they're telling us that they plan to keep going until they've rolled back the sexual revolution and restored what they view as traditional moral order. And when we watch confirmation hearings like this one, where nominees hedge and dodge and refuse to clearly disavow their stated beliefs about sexual perversion while claiming they'll neutrally apply the law, what we're watching is the polite face of a movement that has deeply illiberal and authoritarian goals. So what do we do, because despair is not an option, and resignation is a luxury we cannot afford when so much is at stake for so many vulnerable communities? We need to make judicial confirmations a much higher priority in progressive organizing and voter mobilization, because Senate control determines who gets confirmed, and Democratic senators need to understand that their constituents care intensely about these issues. We need to be much more willing to directly challenge the premises of originalism and textualism and expose them as ideological projects designed to achieve conservative policy goals rather than neutral methods of interpretation. We need to build coalitions across movements, because the fight for reproductive rights and LGBTQ+ rights and disability rights and racial justice are all interconnected when the threat comes from judges committed to rolling back civil rights across the board. We need to explore structural reforms like court expansion and term limits that could rebalance a judiciary that's been captured through tactics of dubious legitimacy, and we need to be unflinching in calling out Christian nationalism for what it is, which is a threat to democracy and pluralism and freedom, not some benign expression of religious faith that deserves deference and accommodation. The judicial nominee in this clip will likely be confirmed because Republicans have the votes, and they're committed to stacking the courts with people who share their ideological vision, and once he's confirmed, he'll have a lifetime appointment to issue rulings that will affect millions of people's lives for decades to come, and some of those rulings will cite precedent and invoke neutral principles and sound like ordinary legal analysis, but they will reflect his conviction that fornication is sexual perversion, and that reflection will have devastating consequences for anyone seeking to assert sexual autonomy or reproductive freedom or the right to love and form families in ways that don't conform to conservative Christian norms. And this is just one nominee, one confirmation hearing, one small piece of a much larger project that's been underway for decades and is accelerating now that Christian nationalists have the political power to implement their agenda at scale. We cannot allow these hearings to happen in obscurity. We cannot treat judicial confirmations as procedural matters that only legal experts need to pay attention to, because the courts are where our rights live or die, and right now they're dying. Every person who cares about justice needs to be contacting their senators, needs to be organizing and mobilizing and making clear that confirming judges who preach about sexual perversion is unacceptable, needs to be building the sustained pressure that's required to change the political calculus around judicial appointments. This is not hyperbole, and it's not alarmism to say that the federal judiciary is being captured by theocrats who will use their power to roll back civil rights because that's precisely what's happening, and we're watching it unfold in real time, and future generations will judge us harshly if we failed to mount adequate resistance when the warning signs were this clear and this urgent.